Alors, today our speaker is Janelle Anderson. Is a Black disabled social worker and researcher. Her work focuses on disability justice and research with communities at the intersection of disability and education. Her work includes the examination of policy research, policy and service delivery for Black Canadian with disability titled The Intersections of Blackness and Disability. Most recently, she co-led IC Community's capacity building research project and environmental scan done in collaboration with the Employment and Social Development Canada. This included a Canada-wide project of services supporting Black and racialized persons with disabilities and the development of an engagement strategy to improve social inclusion and for participation of Black and racialized persons with disabilities in Canada. In addition, Janelle has a background in community engaged research with Black survivors of conflict, developing culturally responsive evaluation frameworks and co-design plans with marginalized stakeholders. Welcome, Janelle, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Iha. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Hey, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Janelle, and thank you again, Siham, for that intro. Again, I'm a Black disabled social worker and researcher. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a brown-skinned Black woman with a large Black afro. I'm wearing a round glasses and a light brown chunky sweater. I am seated in front of a virtual background with a white brick wall and some plants behind me, some green plants. I want to thank OCASI again for inviting me to present at today's webinar. And I also want to thank you all for joining today. And to kick today off, this is the agenda or what we'll be talking about today. So first off, we'll start with an activity, then talk about my story. Then next, we'll talk about disability in Canada, ableism, person first language versus identity first language. Then we'll move on to rethinking disability, and then some calls to action. And to kick today off, I just wanted to get to know you all a little bit better. I know some of you started introducing yourselves in the chat, so thank you for that. In the chat, Siham will put a link to menti.com and a code that you can use to participate. And just let me know when folks are kind of ready. So the code is also on my screen right now. It's 18560643. Awesome. So first off, I just wanted to do a bit of a temperature check. Wondering if you're not able to use an emoji, you're able to just put in a word of how you're feeling, just how you are today. Yes. Awesome. We have like a wide range of stuff, and it's good to just kind of gauge with like pacing. So thank you for participating. Awesome. Awesome. So we're just gonna move on to the next question. If we can. And then just kind of wondering really quickly where folks are joining from today. Awesome. It looks like we have really a good representation across Canada. Thank you again. And then lastly, or not lastly, but just kind of wondering how familiar are folks with today's topics or, concepts that will be discussed today. So we have, disability, ableism, and intersectionality. So it does look like folks are quite familiar with the topics that we'll be talking about today. So thank you for sharing that. And then lastly, before we jump in, I'm just wondering, what are you most looking forward to in today's session? Awesome. So I'm seeing a lot about intersectionality and just kind of being reflective and in general learning more. Awesome. Thank you all for doing that quick participation. So now I'll just jump back into the slides. So, to start, I always like telling my story and my connection to this work. And, I was born and raised in Jamaica, and my journey to Canada began around 2002, 2003. My dad had sponsored both my brother and I, but only my brother was successful. So I was denied because of my disability. And, I was born with a congenital disability. And, the letter that got sent back to us was that I would be a burden on Canada's healthcare system. So, I've reflected a lot on this moment and the trauma that it has caused me. It made me really realize how internalized a lot of ableism or ableist ideals of being a burden, and how that actually skewed how I viewed my body, my usefulness, or how worthy I was, not only to my family, but also to this country. So it really impacted how I've navigated accessing maybe services or asking for help, regardless of whether it's interpersonally or, with regard to accessing services again. I did have an amputation afterwards and reapplied and was successfully sponsored and came to Canada in 2008. So I just like joking around and saying, it actually costed me a leg to get to Canada. And my story is not at all unique, as many of you might know, because you've worked with a lot of your clients that might be in similar predicaments, that a lot of immigrants with disabilities or immigrants with children with disabilities endure this very traumatic process of immigrating to Canada, whether it be migrant workers or immigrants coming to Canada. And it's not only just kind of like being labeled a burden or fearing deportation because someone is disabled within the family. It's also that separation or separating the family system. So I was separated from my brother because he was allowed into Canada while I wasn't. And disability in Canada. So in 2018, Statistics Canada had released a report called the Canada Survey on Disability, which showed that in 2017, about 22% of Canadians aged 15 and over had one or more disabilities. The most common, of course, were pain, flexibility, mobility, and mental health. Others that were reported were sensory disabilities or disabilities that were related to dexterity, learning, memory, or developmental disabilities. Disability in Canada does correlate negatively with employment rates. So income, education, and housing, for example, in the survey, persons with disabilities were less likely to be employed. So that was around 59% than those without disabilities. So that came in around 80% for those aged 25 to 64 years old. Furthermore, of the 6.2 million Canadians with disabilities, about 21.4% identified as immigrants. At the end of 2020, StatsCan released disaggregated race-based data from the survey. So that means that they broke down disability according to racial categories. So they found that 14.3% of disabled people in Canada who responded to the survey identified as racialized, where South Asians had the largest representation. It's really important to note that the numbers of people with disabilities, whether it be immigrants or generally folks who've completed the survey, might be far greater than what was captured. However, due to ableism, stigma, and for immigrants with disabilities, exclusion from Canada or fear of deportation, that, people might not want to identify as disabled. I like to quote Alice Wong, who said, "Disabled people have always existed, whether the word disability is used or not. To me, disability is not a monolith, nor is it a clear-cut binary of disabled and non-disabled. Disability is mutable and ever-evolving. Disability is both apparent and non-apparent. Disability is pain, struggle, brilliance, abundance, and joy. Disability is sociopolitical, cultural, and biological. Being visible and claiming a disabled identity brings risk as much as it brings pride." And I really do like that quote, because for me, it's not a simple thing to, define what disability is, just because it's so diverse. And a lot of things that, people have, they might not consider a disability. And disability and how, folks might consider what is disabling or where they're disabled also, might be dependent on their environment. We also see how medical inadmissibility can disrupt family systems, like I've mentioned before, as well as add to a lot of precarity or instability for one's immigration status in Canada. So like, again, I said, a lot of people might not disclose disability for that fear of being rejected. Okay. And then I included this definition of ableism here, which I was introduced to by a friend and colleague, and it was created by Talia Lewis in community with other disabled, Black disabled, and negatively racialized folks. I really do like this definition, really because it captures or encapsulates how the interlocking nature of the various systems of oppression, and how ableism is very, very much so rooted in racism, colonialism, and all the other isms. It doesn't just stand alone by itself. So it reads, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's values based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place. Health and wellness and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce or produce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So I highlighted that last sentence simply because I think this often gets overlooked. When we kind of talk about, ableism, I think a lot of, non-disabled and sometimes disabled folks just kind of think it lives in the realm of disability. But non-disabled people are also impacted by ableism. So, I'd like you to think really about the last time perhaps you were sick. How did you react? How did you treat yourself? Did you still try to go to work? How do you frame resting? Those are all rooted in ableist notions, how we treat ourselves when we're sick. That's one of the more fundamental examples that I can give. And then a very, concrete example of systemic ableism, where discrimination is basically a legal thing for Canada and restricting movement of disabled folks in the country. This is the one I talked about earlier. So in 2017, the excessive demand cost threshold was about $33,000 over 5 years, or about $6,000 per year. So while the number of refusals because of this provision was 1,000 per year, it resulted in cases where applicants or their children were refused despite their health condition or disability being readily accommodated in Canada. So like I said, for me, that immigration officer who looked at my file kind of looked and determined that my disability would be a burden on Canada's healthcare system. And as such, in 2018, there's been a lot of movement or some changes to Section 38(1)(c), the medical of the Immigration and Refugee Act, which excludes anyone who might reasonably be expected to cause excessive demand or health on health or social services. So the excessive demand cost is linked to the average Canadian per capita health and social services. This means that the government will no longer be allowed to reject permanent resident applications from those with serious health conditions or disabilities to an extent. While this is a significant improvement, many have argued that this clause needs to be removed in total. And even with the changes, it is still excluding a lot of folks with disabilities or families with children with disabilities. So Immigration Canada did claim that the new policy on medical inadmissibility strikes a balance between protecting publicly funded health and social services and including people with disabilities. However, there is an assumption that people with disabilities are not contributing to these publicly funded goods. The most significant change to the clause is that there's been an increase to the cost threshold for medical inadmissibility, like I mentioned. So since the changes have been made, the new cost threshold is about $99,000 over 5 years, or $19,000 per year. On this slide is a diagram depicting the disability poverty cycle, with the outer darker blue circular arrows showing the cyclical relationship between vulnerability to poverty and poor health pointing to disability, which is then pointing or leading to poverty. The light blue inner circular arrows shows the cyclical relationship between social and cultural exclusion and stigma, pointing to denial of opportunities for economic, social, and human development, which again points to the deficits in economic, social, and cultural rights, pointing to reduced participation in society. The diagram here actively demonstrates that disability and poverty are very much so linked. Poverty can never truly be eradicated until, disabled people have equitable access to resources to have their needs met. This means that having a disability might lead to poverty for individuals and their families due to systemic barriers. So we talk about reduced income, high medical expenses, et cetera. And poverty is a kind of consequence of disabilities due to the lack of access to the social determinants of health. So access to healthcare and also, precarious employment. So it's really important to note that poverty is not evenly distributed. As many of you probably already know, it's not evenly distributed in Canada. So the gap between rich and poor is ever widening, and we see that again with after COVID or during COVID, as it disproportionately impacted racialized communities. So we know that Black and racialized people living in poverty are more likely to have poorer health outcomes, fewer job opportunities than non-racialized people. In addition, experiencing poverty also means that you're more likely to be working in precarious jobs, so jobs without benefits, jobs that are high stress. And inevitably, that also contributes to poorer health outcomes. So structural racism, structural ableism plays a significant role in excluding and creating disadvantaged conditions and barriers for racialized disabled people in accessing resources. And as you can imagine, and as you already know, a lot of newcomers, a lot of immigrants and refugees face a lot of stressors. And that also might lead to adverse mental health outcomes. And, without, a social network or social support, social capital, some of these stressors can include access to employment and housing. And for immigrants and with disabilities and immigrant parents with disabled children who make it to Canada, what we consider normal or, this ableist idea of normal, their view of disability is compounded with the pre and post migration factors, which could present additional and considerable barriers to settling. And we'll just kind of shift gears a bit to linguistic ableism. So this is a definition by Lydia Brown, from Autistic Hoya. It reads, using language of disability, either directly or through a metaphor, as a way to insult other people or dismiss other people, express your vehement loathing for them, their viewpoints, or invalidate their viewpoints is actually extremely ableist, often sanist, neurotypicalist, oddist, or vidist. And here are some common examples of ableist language that we typically use in our day-to-day lives. Some that we probably didn't realize but might be ableist. The tables give an alternative also to language folks can use instead. So here's a couple of examples that I'll just include here. So the table on the left suggests replacing they are confined to a wheelchair with they use a wheelchair. Another example they provide is that they are disabled or handicapped. They suggest replacing that with they have a disability. The table on the right suggests using wild, amazing, or unbelievable instead of the ones we typically use, like that's crazy, oh my God, that's insane, that's nuts. Another example here on the table on the right, and they suggest using disabled instead of maybe crippled, differently abled, handicapable, or special needs, which are more of the common euphemisms that are typically used today. And now let's kind of talk about these person first versus identity first language. And also I'll talk a bit about reclamation of language. So these tables are such a good demonstration of the variety of perspectives on language usage that's rooted in, person first versus identity first language. And also, like I said, the reclamation of language within the disability community. So person first emphasizes that, the person comes before the disability. For example, a person with a disability or a person who is blind. So this kind of came about during the disability rights movement, where we wanted to kind of see the person and not the disability, as I mentioned previously, that the value is within the person themselves. And identity first language puts, again, identity first. So the disability comes first in the description. So for example, you'd say disabled person or blind person. So, there's also some in the disability community who have reclaimed some ableist language that have been historically been used to subjugate disabled people. For example, there are some folks that use crip to describe themselves, or perhaps mad to describe themselves. While the mainstream, a lot of organizations I've noticed have, been shifting towards using more person first language, many of us in the disability community do choose to use identity first language. And that's just to destigmatize disability, right? But it's really important to note that disabled people have the agency and the right to identify how they wish to, how they want to identify, and that should also be respected. So I do believe that there has to be somewhat of a cultural shift towards embracing difference and challenging, again, what we consider normal, in society, especially as we, talk about disability. So like I mentioned, this whole conversation around people first versus identity first, some of that is rooted in, how folks view disability. And the word itself, and in conversations, everyday conversations, I've seen how the word itself, like disabled, disability, brings up a lot of discomfort in non-disabled folks. So people oftentimes ignore that difference or try to soften the framing of disability. There's almost like a toxic positivity spin when it comes to disability, which often ends up, in people using euphemisms to describe a person's disability. So, I've read a couple of them. So we'll talk about special needs or differently abled, disability with a capital A. So there's many euphemisms, but the message is that disability makes you uncomfortable. And for you to get around that discomfort, you rely on like cutesy, childlike language to make me, a disabled person, know that you see past my disability. But not only that, but the way that we talk about it must be palatable or perhaps positive for that non-disabled person to then, in a way, objectify you as an inspiration for the wrong reasons. So while I acknowledge like maybe the good intentions for people utilizing euphemisms when talking about disability, it's really important that we talk about privilege of being well-intended without not having to think about or deal with the impact of using said euphemisms. So the word disabled really is not a bad word. However, we have to move towards normalizing disability in order to reduce stigma. And that might also help, or in some ways help, some internalized ableism, how disabled people view themselves, how we kind of internalize how society view disabled people. So going back to Lydia Brown, who suggests that language is one tool of an oppressive system. Being aware of language, for those of us who have the privilege of being able to change our language, can help us understand how pervasive ableism is. Ableism is systematic, institutional, devaluing of bodies and minds deemed deviant, abnormal, defective, subhuman, or just less than. And they conclude that ableism is violence. So now shifting towards maybe rethinking disability. So it really is important when we look at these numbers that we also reflect on how society views disability, because it is a significant barrier along with these structural factors that we talked about, in which people with disabilities face in accessing necessities. When we look at this holistically, again, you see how other forms of repression, ableism, racism, along with like gender biases, this population is at an even higher risk of experiencing health, poverty, and human rights violations, unemployment, underemployment, and overall exclusion from participating fully in society. The labor market, for example, housing or education sector is not accessible to a lot of people with disabilities because either the refusal to accommodate or we're just never thought about. Folks don't necessarily expect disability in the room. So a lot of spaces that we enter as disabled folk are inaccessible, and we have to request accommodations to be able to participate or, participate like everybody else equitably. So the social model of disability shifts the blame to the environment and acknowledges that there are multiple valid ways of participating in society. There's multiple valid ways of contributing to society. And that's why we really have to challenge what we consider normal, that only recognizes one way and, kind of excludes people who participates in a maybe non-normative way. And that really disadvantages a lot of people with disabilities. How can we advocate for implementing more equitable structures, more inclusive structures and policies? I think that's really important. Always expect disability into the room, right? Any event or any programming that's being ran, always expect that there will be a person with disability entering the room. And go back to that first slide that says 1 in 5 Canadians do identify as having a disability. And then we can also touch on like capitalism and how that, skews how we view our use or usefulness or worth, especially based on how we contribute to the labor market. A lot of people with disability due to health, social and environmental factors have limited participation within the labor market. And as well, we can talk about the intentional exclusion of folks with disabilities. The narrative then becomes in the mind of society is that folks with disabilities don't participate and that they rely on the welfare state, right? I'll give an example again. I took an Uber one time to work, and the Uber driver kind of made a comment when I told him, yeah, I work. And he just kind of said, good for you. You're not sitting at home relying on the welfare system. And that was so offensive. And I know in maybe in his mind that was like a compliment, but it's rooted in a lot of ableism, and it doesn't look at how people are willfully excluded by, how inaccessible the education system might be. And again, the employment rates of people with disabilities, because, a lot of places are not accessible or accommodating. And we can also see, like, even in my exclusion initially, when we first applied to Canada, a lot of how you'll participate in the labor market and how you'll contribute to the economy was tied to being excluded as well from Canada, because I'd be a burden. Again, there's the assumption that I'm not going to contribute to the system, which I am. And then another way of rethinking disability, I put here disability justice. So this is a term coined by Black, Brown, queer, and trans members of the original Disability Justice Collective that was founded in 2008 by Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. So it's a framework that really centers on the diverse experiences of disabled people that were invisibilized, excluded within mainstream disability discourse, such as those who are racialized, immigrant, queer, trans, etc. So it is a framework that acknowledges that each body is unique and disabled people have intersecting identities. So it really is important to understand that relationship between ableism and those other forms of repression, and for example, when we examine the impact of COVID, especially on disabled people, a disability justice lens is very important, as it, in fact, highlights that the intersectional experiences of Black and racialized disabled people, were disproportionately impacted by COVID. I've included the 10 principles of disability justice on this slide. But for today, I'm only focusing on intersectionality, the first principle. So it does look like a lot of folks are already familiar with intersectionality as a framework. So I'll quickly talk about this. But I like quoting Audre Lorde, who is a Black feminist scholar, who importantly said, "We do not live single-issued lives." And disability is often talked about as like a single issue identity. We're not only disabled, we are also coming from a specific experience of race, class, sexuality, age, religious background, etc., geographic location, immigration status. Intersectionality, again, is that concept introduced by Black feminist scholars. Again, Bell Hooks is one, Audre Lorde, as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. So there's this overlapping, it looks at the overlapping roles of race, class, gender in how oppression functions. And it also allows us to study that relationship among multiple dimensions of social relationships and subject formations. So it does seek to examine how different identities, like we talked about earlier, interact on multiple and simultaneous levels of creating systemic and social inequality. So, it really allows us to understand how one singular person can be in a privileged position while also occupying an oppression position at the same time. So one example I like kind of using with myself, I'm a Black disabled woman. And in my role as a student advisor, my previous role as a student advisor, with disabled students coming to me to kind of talk about and develop an accommodation plan in school, while we both occupy a disability identity, I occupy a position of privilege as I'm somewhat of a gatekeeper in my role that is providing access to accommodations that that student needs. So although both of us are disabled, I'm still having a privileged position in that setting. And it changes depending on the environment and maybe, positions of power that you hold. It's ever shifting. It's not static. And then here I've included a few calls to actions. I really would urge folks to challenge ableist assumptions and behaviors. And for example, we must start framing our work as, working with rather than doing things for people with disabilities. The latter is really ableist and infantilizing in a sense. It's not empowering, right? And there's this idea of critical reflection that we should all be engaging in. It's often described as a best practice for folks working on the front lines. It's important that we reflect on the impact of our actions rather than the intention of said actions, which might be rooted in our social location and privilege, as we are not left with the impacts of these actions. Thus, again, to circle back, we must challenge and unlearn what is considered normal. Move away from this deficit model of disability of it's the person's kind of fault, all the blame lies in the disabled person. Rather than, kind of looking at how the system is set up that, adds to the disabling of what the disability is. If the environment is indeed accommodating and accessible, a lot of folks are able to navigate, again, they might not navigate as what's seen as a norm, but they're still able to navigate. And we must also uplift and prioritize voices of, folks who are disabled, folks who are immigrants and disabled, folks who are racialized and disabled. Be an ally, because how we frame and treat disability in our practice will really determine how, our clients, how, folks with disabilities coming to see you, or families with children with disabilities also view themselves. And lastly, ableism, again, I have to reiterate, not only impacts disabled people, non-disabled people are also impacted by ableism. And the calls to action here state, look at the individual holistically. We do not live single issued lives, and disability intersect with other identities. We have to move beyond the AODA compliance. So I know this is very Ontario specific. I know not many other provinces have a formalized accessibility or law for accessibility. But being inclusive, I think, as we learn today, can be more than just removing physical barriers. I think that's often where we start and land on disability inclusion. So it's really good to have ramps and elevators to give physical access, but we also have to look towards attitudinal barriers as well. So like we talked about how we view disability, what we view as the norm, kind of thinking outside of that disability, there's nothing wrong with the word disability. There's, also the last one, it's slipping my mind right now, but there are multiple ways of being inclusive, and we should move beyond like only removing physical barriers. There's also a need for outreach, education, and the normalization of disability. I'll acknowledge that, different communities might view disability in different ways. How can we normalize disability? How can we talk about disability so that it reduces stigma? And in reducing stigma, does that make it more accessible for folks to access service without feeling shame? Their other call to action is offer targeted, culturally responsive programs for Black, Indigenous, racialized immigrants, and refugees, newcomers with disabilities. We must incorporate responsive approaches to service delivery, and of course, look at and understand the person in their environment holistically. There's also the integrative case management call to action here, which I know a lot of you have probably been familiar with. So there should be streamlined settlement services along with disability services. They're often siloed. And it would be better to streamline them so that there's better support for newcomers with disabilities. I did an audit last year that kind of looked to see if there were services for racialized, Black, Indigenous, immigrant newcomers with disabilities. And there were very few services that provided programs at that intersection that was responsive. And again, this is really due to how the current structure, like funding structure, is for these kinds of services. So services are more likely to be catered to ethnocultural needs, as there is kind of an assumption that immigrants share a homogeneous experience or the same experience. But that assumption really erases the experiences of folks with disabilities. And then, there should also be knowledge and awareness to provide tools, resources, and information to support newcomers or families with disabled children to feel empowered in order to navigate these various systems that they'll interact with. So, the medical system, and of course, the education system. So lastly, I'd just like to end off with a reflection exercise. And then I'm just going to ask folks to pull up Menti again, see if you can perhaps add the link again to the chat as well as the code. That'd be good. So the first reflection I'd like folks to participating is, I know there was a lot that was said today, and I hope the pace was okay, but what were some of the things that perhaps resonated with you today? That's a really interesting one, that change in perspective and seeing the person as a person. I see a disability poverty cycle mentioned there, intersectionality, ableist language. And I love that someone mentioned that ableism impacts or affects everyone. That's coming up quite a lot there. And the need for harmonized supports. Thank you all for participating there. And then the next reflection question here is, was there anything that we discussed today that you're still unpacking? Mhm. You see mental health, how to move, oh, where to go from here. Yep. Ableism in language, identity first language is coming up. Critically thinking about how ableism affects everyone. Oh, practical strategies to advocate for, yeah. For the practical strategies, I'll touch on a little bit. I think it's more so working with BIPOC disabled folks and really prioritizing their voice. How can you lend your position or the power that you might wield to give access to? I think a lot of initiatives should be led by folks most impacted. So, rather than doing it for, how do you give access to people doing the work to do the advocacy or to support the advocacy? Thank you so much. So many interesting things that's still being unpacked. Equitable communication, access for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, access to supports and resources in a new country. Awesome. And this is a really interesting one, is how to provide culturally sensitive services when working with clients whose families have differing views of disability. And, for that, I'd say it's meeting the person where they are. In the work that I do, I acknowledge a lot of folks with disability might not, again, identify as being disabled. They might not want to be having that label because of maybe, the implications of what is being attached to that. So just really meeting them where they're at. There can be some psychoeducation around disability to just kind of talk about and normalize it, but it's really meeting them where they're at. For me, I've met a lot of disabled people who identify as disabled and some who kind of identify as differently abled. And that's fine, right? It's just a lot of psychoeducation and normalizing that disability experience. And then the last reflection question I have here is, how can this impact the work that you do with newcomers? What can you take away in your practice? Yeah. I smile at that one. Always expect people with disabilities in the room. Follow their lead. Do not assume. I think is very important. Follow the person's lead. A new perspective. And being aware of the person first language. Providing more insights into the multiple barriers they may be facing. Awesome. Newcomers having multiple barriers impacted a lot because of unethical behavior. And again, following clients' leads. That's awesome. So I will leave it there. I really appreciate all of you for participating in these activities and the reflection exercise. I think it's really important. It looks like there's a lot that can be taken away. So I appreciate you continuing the journey here. Thank you.
Hi, Janelle. We have some questions in the Q&A option. Maybe you can try to address them.
So I see the first one. Many of the disabled people I'm in community with including myself, feel that person first is insulting, as it suggests folks need a reminder that we are human, not deny important to input. I know a lot of services, or in the mainstream, a lot of folks kind of rely on person first as the new normal, and that's more polite. So the comment left, but I do appreciate that perspective, and that's where I also land. I've also seen, person living with disabilities, also another one that I kind of find a little insulting, because I don't live with disability. Like, I can't just pack it up and put it in a corner and then go about my life, right? So these are kind of like euphemisms that people use to kind of navigate the discomfort of talking about disability. Like I said, a lot of people, you go on social media, you see a lot of conversation around using identity first language. That's really impactful, again, to reduce stigma, to normalize disability, to kind of say, we exist, right? Again, I will just kind of leave it there and say, it's really important to respect and recognize that not all disabled people identify the same way, or like with identity first language. So it's up to that disabled person, again. And then I see a question here. Forgive me if you've already answered this. How should youth workers, social workers, and teachers be able to address this in a way where we are not scolding or aggravating the situation in a group setting? Should this topic even be discussed as a group of younger people or adults who use this ableist language? Okay. So similarly, again, I think it's great to discuss these things in groups, because again, not singling out folks or just kind of leaving it to be a conversation that only disabled people participating. I think that's not the way to go. It's good to normalize. Again, I think the key word here is to normalize it, to talk about disability, so that we're not feeling like uncomfortable with it. So, I think it's really important to provide psychoeducation in a non-judgmental way, to like you said, without scolding. You're just presenting it. These languages, how have they been historically rooted? Crazy, we use crazy a lot every day, and like, it's hard. Like, sometimes I trip up and I say it, but it's not kind of, scolding yourself or shaming yourself for doing it. It will happen. Again, like I say, these are normal in our conversations, but how can we describe how these ableist languages, how they've been historically been used? And, again, it's really important to have like alternatives situated there as well, to help people along the way, and to have a lot of reflection as well. I think there's a lot of ways that you could potentially do things that are in a non-judgmental way, or kind of like talking top down and scolding. But that's great to do it in a group as well, and to have a discussion around it. How can employment services make themselves as more accessible for disabled? Make themselves as more accessible for disabled clients in a hybrid online setting? I think, it's important to ask, or at least be open when you have like an accessible statement on events or appointment scheduling. Like, do you require anything to make this accessible for you, right? I find a lot of folks since COVID have started thinking a bit more about inclusion. I've been attending a lot more events that, have like an ASL interpreter, which is great. But it's good to ask what folks' needs are. Make it explicit that you're, able to provide accommodations if needed as well. Can we say that non-heterosexual people live with a disability? I'm not sure if I understand that question, but anyone can live with it, or anyone can have a disability. Oh, and I see here, previously I've learned to use the word diverse ability, but is that a euphemism I should stay clear of? There's like, I've never seen this one, but yes, like anything other than just saying disability, it's a euphemism because you're prettying up the word, and I get the intention behind it. I've talked to some service providers who, make it clear that they might avoid putting disability in the name of the services just so that doesn't exclude people from accessing their services. So I do get the intention behind it, but how do we move towards normalizing a society that accepts disability if we can't just say the word, or just provide education or to reduce the stigma? So yeah, I personally, I find anything that's just talking about disability that doesn't explicitly say disability is a euphemism. I see a comment here, the R word is triggering at times as well as the word crazy. Yes, that's true. And that's why we kind of like try to use alternatives to talk about when folks talk about mad or crazy, right? Because it's often dismissive. So toxic positivity is basically you're kind of putting a positive spin on someone's circumstances. So, you can't accept like someone having a bad time. There's always something about the silver lining, oh, you're disabled, but oh, look at you, you're going outside, I'll use an example. Every time I step outside, I have to kind of deal with someone making a comment about my disability. I was crossing the street at a major intersection, just, living life, going about my day, like, my disability is both visible and invisible. I use a cane. A lady approached me and just kind of made a comment about my disability and just went towards, good for you for stepping outside, essentially, right? Good for you to essentially be seen in public. And yeah, toxic positivity is just this over-reliance on putting a positive spin on anything. Being sick, being disabled, experiencing like unfortunate circumstances. I think a lot of it's been a part of like the dominant narrative I find in recent times to just be positive all the time, which it's not the case for a person living normally, right? You experience highs and lows every day, and it's fine to experience those highs and lows. It doesn't always have to be high all the time. Those are all the questions I am seeing in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Janelle. For me, some of the takeaways from this session is look at the individuals holistically so that you are able to address those issues in a very appropriate way. And then also offering targeted culturally responsive programs for all groups, regardless of where we stand, whether we are in the position of power or not. And then also just streamlining settlement services together with disability. So with that, if there are any additional questions, just put them in the Q&A. And if there are any concerns, put in the chat. But for now, I ask for a few minutes. We are going to launch a poll about this webinar, and feel free to be sincere as you can so that we can improve in our next sessions. Sorry, for those who are taking our courses, you will use the learning platform to do the survey. But anyone who is not doing the course, please fill out this questionnaire.
Pour les participants dans nos cours, vous pouvez répondre à ce questionnaire, à ce survey sur la plateforme Learn at Work. Donc, et puis, les questions sont en français et en anglais pour ceux qui demandent. Hein. Janelle, we have a question in the Q&A if you would like to address.
The first one is in French.
Siham? Siham, you can help us with the translation of the first question so that she can answer.
Bien entendu, oui. Alors, c'est plus une remarque, une question. Donc, en situation minoritaire, on vit une situation où tout le monde connaît tout le monde, ce qui est très excellent, mais si tu es en situation de handicap, là, c'est trop grave, car tu seras connu et discriminé définitivement en termes de recherche, d'emploi, même si tu veux faire ton mieux ou de ton mieux pour être une personne essentielle pour la communauté, excepté la classe privilégiée où l'accompagnement est maximal.
Oh, sorry, is there an English translation for the first one, please?
So maybe I can translate this. It's basically that when you are living in a minority context and where everyone knows everyone, when you are a person with disability, you will be faced to more discrimination and to more challenges. Puis, surtout, mainly, sorry, in terms of finding a work. And yeah, so that was the first question or remark. And then we have another one.
Yeah, that's actually a very insightful comment to the first. Yeah, a lot of disabled folks, even, you know, like I said, disabled people aren't just disabled, they have multiple identities. And that in and of itself could provide like a lens at which marginalization can occur, like they said. So, you know, in my own research and work, I've kind of compared the experiences of Black people as well as people with disabilities, and we look at the disability poverty cycle and how poverty is racialized, you know, just kind of making the linkages of the disproportionate experiences that might occur within disability, right? Disability, again, we saw the numbers of the experience with employment, education, and also living in poverty. And, you know, if you looked at a look even deeper at it with a equity lens, an intersectional lens, you can see like can you break down the numbers in disability even further by not only race, but also like gender, sexuality, and how all of those, kind of intersect? What are the various forms of oppression that are kind of working together to further marginalize this person's experience, right? How the system is structured does exclude folks who are not only just disabled, but might be racialized and disabled, might be queer and disabled, right? As well as multiple others. And then another comment here is saying, to the question about queer folks being disabled by the social model of disability, any marginalized group experiences disability through barriers to inclusion. Rates of things like depression, anxiety, poverty, being unhoused, etc., are also higher in marginalized groups. Yes, exactly. Anybody can be disabled. What's considered a disability, I think, might be that iffy part. Like I said, I personally don't define disability. A lot of people are disabled, and I don't want to say they don't know it, but just don't identify with it. Mental health, as that commenter mentioned, is considered a disability. What are the limitations in society, right? If the environment is set up in a way that limits your access as well, and how you navigate that environment. Like, again, I use myself an example as an example a lot because it's true for me. Like in my home, I've made my home accessible. So I'm not disabled within my home. The moment I step outside of my home, depending on where I'm going, what like transportation I'm using, it might not be accessible. And that's more disabling for me in how I navigate. But anyone can be disabled. It doesn't matter the identity. That was beautifully summarized there, CJ. People are concerned about identifying themselves with a disability, and that's fair. And I like to bring back up that quote from Alice Wan, who says that, identifying with that, with disability, or, it not only comes sometimes with pride and, community, because there's disability community and it's really strong interdependent, but it also comes with like harm for some groups, institutionalization for some groups as well. So it's not just black or white, right? There's a lot of gray areas. So yes, there are people who might not identify with disability. In this presentation, we talk about how Canada has legally and systematically excluded immigrants with disabilities. So there's, of course, that fear of deportation, or fear of actually being allowed into Canada, despite the cost threshold being expanded, right? For those who can hide a disability, they might opt to hide it so it doesn't impact their movement in Canada, right? So there's a lot of implications with identifying with disability, and I think that's really important to say. So yeah, that also impacts how people kind of say it out loud. Oh yeah, I have a disability, or yeah, I have a condition or something, right? I think that's all the questions again in the Q&A.
Thank you, Janelle, and thank you to everyone who made the time to attend. The recording will be available on our OCASI YouTube channel once the captions will be embedded in both languages. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Okay, we can all